They called it a dancing victory, until the music stopped forever. In Lexington, Kentucky, 1976, everyone remembers the night Annabel Smith won the county dance crown and smiled like she owned the world. Nobody remembers the smile that came after. 32 years later, the woman who vanished from those photographs was living under a new name, and the person who walked out of that gym that night with jealousy in her pockets was finally pulled from a house in another state, handcuffed beside her parents. This is the story of a Kentucky 1976 cold case solved, an arrest that shattered a town, a family who wrapped itself in lies, and the slow, stubborn work of detectives who refused to let a girl's life be forgotten. Before we dive deeper, take a second to subscribe to Calis-Crime Vault and smash the like button. It's much appreciated. And keep these stories coming your way. Drop your state in the comments below and let me know where you're watching from. They still played the same kind of music at the county fair in Lexington. The swaying country tinge pop that made teenage knees knock and ribbons flutter. The dance contest was a whole town in miniature. Parents taking pictures under string lights, teenagers in borrowed dresses, an MC with a microphone and a voice like a weathered radio. Annabel Smith had come back from a summer job with a laugh that caught and held the room. She danced as if she were folding sunlight into her skirt. She won, and for one bright, ridiculous instant, everything in town shone around her. What followed was a short, brutal silence that lasted a lifetime. The discovery that night, the scene in the back alley behind the gymnasium, the blanket pulled over the shape, was not the kind of thing a small town forgets. The officers who responded were county officers, not prepared for the way grief multiplies when a life is cut off in the bright middle of a Friday night. Annabel's parents, the name on the obituary, the crowd at the funeral. These were the first layers of the story everyone told themselves to make sense of the senseless. But truth rarely stays where people want it. It burrows. It gets buried. It waits for a hand to pick at the soil. From the start, the case was threaded with rumor and contradiction. Witnesses remembered arguing voices drifting from behind the gym. A pair of scuffed shoes found near the door. A trophy, the competition's small brass dancer, discovered with a smear no one wanted to call by name. Someone said they'd seen two girls leave together. Someone else swore Annabel had argued with the tall contestant from the rival school. There were photographs, grainy and precious. Annabel with her ribbon, laughing with friends who years later would find it impossible to reconcile that face with the memory they carried. Detectives cataloged what they could. Statements, timelines, small inconsistencies. In 1976, forensic science had limits. There were no quick DNA databases, no overnight analysis, no tiny laboratories in every county. The evidence they had would have to be interpreted by interviews and instinct. The lead detective, Harry Boone, kept a notebook and a cigarette burn on the edge of his hand from the nights he couldn't stop thinking. He interviewed every teen who had taken the floor that night. He circled the names like constellations and hoped a pattern would emerge. One name kept resurfacing in private conversations. A contestant named Lori Whitman, tall, controlled, with a reputation for competitive seriousness. Lori had been Annabel's opponent in the final round. She had also been seen arguing near the bleachers afterward, according to a classmate who came forward early but whose nerves made her testimony fray under cross-examination. There was a history whispered and petty, of rivalry over trophies, attention, and a boy, the kind of small, sharp resentments that feel enormous when you're 17. But suspicion is not guilt, and the police had no smoking gun. There were reasons not to make an arrest. Unclear motives, inconsistent witness statements, families withstanding in town. For months, the case zigzagged through police interviews and town gossip. People took sides in diners and barbershops. Some said Lori would never do such a thing. Others, with the cruel ease of hindsight, told stories that stitched a villain out of a face they had always disliked. Without definitive physical proof, the case cooled. Detectives never stopped working it. But as seasons changed, the urgency dimmed. Cases go cold not because people stop caring. They go cold because evidence loses its heat and human memory begins to soften. Files were shelved. Names remained liabilities in the town's daily life, but not always in the legal sense. Annabel's family moved through their loss in public and private. They planted a bench by the high school and 2 roses in the yard, and they learned painfully to live around the hole the town had been forced to recognize. The rumor mill never slept. In late-night conversations, the dance hall turned into a theater for what-ifs. Someone swore a Whitman had been seen leaving town that night. Someone else said the Whitmans had offered to pay for the funeral as a thin, shocking apology. The stories were never the same, but they never went away either. Community memory is stubborn that way. It keeps repeating a chorus until somebody finally writes the bridge. Decades passed. The young were old enough to be parents and then grandparents. The world changed. Cell phones, chips in the corner of society's eye, laboratories that could pull genetic fingerprints from dust. Detective Boone retired and became a gray figure who shuffled into the coffee shop sometimes, still looking for angles. In quiet moments, he would uncap his pen and leaf through the old case file, always convinced that a missing piece existed and that if he kept turning over the stones, it would reveal itself. That missing piece came in a voice not from the town, but from a stranger on the phone. A woman in Asheville, North Carolina, called the cold case hotline in 2008 after seeing a feature on local television about cold case reinvestigations. She said she'd used to live in Kentucky and had seen a photograph on a thrift store postcard that looked like a girl from Lexington who had once taken trophy. She mentioned a name she hadn't given in 30 years. Lori Whitman. Her tone was ordinary, but her details were not. She told a story not of guilt, but of presence. A woman in a new town with a new name, living quietly with 2 older people who had called her May for decades. The caller meant no harm, she said. She just wanted a missing person found. Boone, who had followed the case through seasons of silence, took the call as a thread he could pull. The modern detectives who had taken up cold cases for the county were younger, acute with new tools. But Boone was the only man still carrying those old pages like talismans. He briefed the new cold case unit. They did what the 70s could not. They dug into old police reports and cross-checked them with new databases. They subpoenaed phone and financial records where the law allowed, and they obtained DNA samples from preserved evidence. The most important breakthrough came not from the forensic lab, but from a ledger. A clerical error in a notarized document decades old had left a trail, a transcribed name, an initial, a postmark that matched a town in North Carolina. The Whitmans had left Kentucky without raising flags if you did not know to look for them. But people move with bills and signatures, and paper remembers. Once this small trail was followed, a satellite of small facts formed into a map. When investigators knocked on the door in Asheville, the woman who opened it did not look like the person the town remembered from a 70s photograph. The lines of her face had deepened. Her hands were steady. She had the kind of calm people practice when they have kept enormous secrets for years. Her parents, Harold and June Whitman, stood behind her on the porch like a tableau from someone else's life. They were warm and ordinary. A retired postal worker, a woman who kept her hair in soft curls. They invited the officers in for tea, as if this were a polite visit. But the arrangements of their house told another story. Boxes in the attic contained school photographs, ribbons, and tucked between the pages of a yellowed yearbook, a program from that very dance competition in Lexington, 1976. There was a tidy, crumpled ticket stub, and in a safety deposit box the bank released with a court order, a brass trophy, the same kind that had been found near the gym all those years ago. There were letters, written in a nervous hand, where the woman, now calling herself May Whitman, referred to the night I lost myself in a sentence she scratched half away. The arrest was quiet in its violence. It did not need a siren to be loud. The community would feel it in every corner of their Saturday morning conversations. May, whose real name was Lori Whitman, born and raised in Lexington, was led from her house in a small municipal police car handcuffed. But the image that seared into people was not the metal or the cameras. It was her parents, later charged as co-conspirators, standing on the same steps next to her with faces like cliffs. They had not fled. They had not lied in haphazard ways. They had, according to indictments, knowingly concealed the truth, helped create a new identity, and helped maintain it for decades. When news of the arrests reached Lexington, the word betrayal was used more times than one could count. For Annabel's mother, present at a statement to the press, there was no vindication that could stitch the missing years back together. "We wanted to know why," she said, voice small and raw. "We wanted to know what happened to our daughter. We wanted to put her to rest." That quietness, the careful, precise unhappiness of a parent who has lived 30 years in question, opened the case to a community that was ready to re-examine itself and its memory. The courtroom became the place where stories that had once slipped through fingers were forced into form. Prosecutors painted a picture of calculated concealment. They argued that jealousy had ripened in a 17-year-old heart into violence, and that the Whitmans had made the choice to hide it because, as the prosecution claimed, they loved their child more than they loved the truth. Defense attorneys, with a cooler cadence, argued accident and confusion. If crime had occurred, they said, it had not been premeditated murder, but a tragic confrontation gone too far. A shove, a fall. A panic family doing what families sometimes do in moments of horror: hide. The defense introduced character witnesses who spoke of Lori's kindness and her nervous hands. They introduced medical documents from the 70s, suggesting the scene might have been different than earlier reports said. Witness testimony was the courtroom's axis. There were those who remembered the rivalry between dancers as something ordinary and theatrical. Teenagers performing anger and revenge as if it were part of a script. There were others who swore they had seen Lori leave with Annabel and that the two had been arguing, escalating fast, voices sharp enough to carry across the parking lot. There was a witness who recanted years later, having told an interviewer in a state of confusion that her memory had been shaped by town gossip. That recantation sat like a knife in the prosecution's case, but other voices were stronger. One eyewitness, a man named Harold Jenkins, who had been in his 20s that night and who had kept a distance in life as if from a wound, took the stand with hands that trembled. He told the court plainly about the argument by the concession stand. It started with a laugh. Annabel laughed, and it was like a flare. And then Lori grabbed her arm. There was a push. I tried to run, but I was frozen. Jenkins's voice did not climb to melodrama. It held like someone trying to read a passage that would not let go of him. His testimony, corroborated by a friend who had seen the two leave together, stitched together the narrative the prosecution wanted. The prosecution also had forensic threads. The brass trophy found in the Whitman's box matched the kind of trophy from the competition, and there were fibers on the base that matched fabric samples from a dress the Whitmans had kept in a cedar chest, along with Annabel's program tucked into a journal. Most persuasive of all was a forensic reanalysis that used technology unavailable in 1976. Lab technicians had found trace amounts of genetic material on a wrapper recovered from the back alley that matched a living relative of Annabel. Not her DNA, but a familial marker that made the origin unmistakably local. The lab could not say with absolute certainty the identity of the assailant from the materials found, but in concert with the other evidence, it tilted a scale that had for decades been balanced on rumor. Courtroom days blurred into months. The defense tried to shake witness accounts by pointing to the town's gossip machine, the intolerance for difference that had always slinged accusations. The prosecution, meanwhile, threaded the social pressure through the Whitmans' lives. Letters burned, phone calls erased, relocations timed too neatly. The public watched on, galvanized by the case's provocation. The idea that a family could carry a crime like a relic from town to town and expect it to remain unremarked. For Annabel's family, there was relief emotion, but only a small measure. Nothing in a father's throat can bring back laughter. Then came a moment that changed the tone of the trial. An eyewitness came forward in the defense's favor, a woman who had been in the gym's janitorial closet that night and who had told no one for 30 years because she had been ashamed of speaking up. "I thought it wasn't my place," she said. "I was young. I was scared." Her testimony described seeing two girls hustle past her, the taller one pulling the smaller toward the alley. She described a heated private argument. She had not spoken earlier because she feared involvement. Now, her memory raw and unblinking, It matched the prosecution's version in a way that breathed life into their narrative. The verdict came after weeks of testimony and the cadence of a community's memory laid bare. The sentence, murder in the second degree, reflected the jury's attempt to weigh intent against panic. They concluded there had been a killing born of a confluence of jealous rage and fear. Lori Whitman, now in her 50s, was convicted. Her parents were found guilty of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal a death. The courtroom hummed with small, public noises, sobs, the rustle of papers, the deft sound of pens. For many, it was final. For others, it was a beginning of legal appeals that would gnaw at the edges of conviction. But trials do not end the work of truth. After the verdict, on a late afternoon when the courthouse shadows were lengthening, a witness named Marcy Dale asked to speak to the detective who had reopened the case. Marcy had been 20 that year, and in the years that followed she'd married, moved, and kept quiet. She approached Boone with hands that still remembered handwriting. "I didn't tell you everything," she said, looking small with the weight of a past she had carried alone. "There was someone else, not in the way they think, a person who knew more and stayed silent." She fingered the seam of her purse. "I heard a name once in a conversation, someone older who used to coach the dance team. They'd always favor Lori a little too much. I thought then it was just favoritism. Now, I'm not sure." Detective Boone took the note and felt the old flame of investigation flare in his chest. His life had been a ledger of other people's mistakes. But what Marcy said could be a hinge to another door. The idea that someone in authority had smoothed resentment into something more complicated came with its own sorrow. If true, it meant the town had enabled an environment where a jealous teen could be guided into catastrophe, and then protected by adults who chose silence over accountability. What followed was a quieter chapter of the investigation. Prosecutors mulled over Marcy's statements. The defense said such talk was a desperate attempt to muddy the waters. Some in the town whispered that the case was already resolved and that digging deeper would only reopen scars. But for Annabel's family, for Boone, for those who had never stopped naming the name in the dark, the possibility of a fuller truth mattered more than the convenience of closure. Under oath in a civil deposition years later, Harold Whitman, the father, finally unburdened something that had lodged in his chest like a splinter. "We thought we were protecting our daughter," he said in a voice that was suddenly thin. "We thought we were fixing an accident. We never imagined the weight of the lie. There were people who told us not to go to the police. They said it would ruin the family, ruin a good girl. We were frightened and selfish. We thought time would make it small." The phrase "we thought" reverberated across the courtroom. It was not an exculpation. It was an admission that families, in their instinct to protect, sometimes choose the wrong thing. It was also proof that communities can be culpable when they valorize reputation over candor. Outside the courtroom, the town of Lexington wrestled with its reflection. People who'd lived there since 1976 re-examined their recollections. The high school placed a plaque under the gym lights, not for the verdict, but for Annabel herself, in memory of a young woman taken too soon. It was small, formal, and unsatisfactory, but it was something physical to touch. The Whitman sentence was not the end of the story. Appeals were filed. Conversations with parole boards took place in the cold light of procedural language. Some in town argued for leniency, remembering the Whitmans' quiet kindnesses, the way they had served at church or coached little leagues. Others argued that human life had been sacrificed for a parental lie, and that kindness could not outweigh the cost. But the most enduring consequence of the case was not legal. It was the way lives rearranged themselves around knowledge. New friendships formed among those who had once stood on opposite sides of the rumor fence. Annabel's younger brother, once withdrawn and angry, volunteered at the high school dance program, teaching youngsters to move without envy. He said to a local reporter, "She loved the music. She always did. I can't make that night go away, but I can make sure other kids dance for the right reasons." And there were social ripples that extended farther than anyone in Lexington had first imagined. The story was picked up by national outlets as an eerie instance of how small town secrets could travel like seeds in the wind. It became, in some narratives, an allegory about the limits of nostalgia. The idea that the past is not a soft cloak, but a pressure cooker of accidents and choices. The documentary team that first aired the cold case segment in Asheville followed the trial and filmed the elderly detective walking the scene where it had all happened. In an interview, Boone said something that cut across the messy legalities. "We're not here to punish the dead. We're here to tell the truth about what happened to them. The law is our compass, but it's the stories, the honest ones, that keep the memory alive." Then, in a way that made the whole case feel less like a neatly resolved story than the opening of a volume of lives, came the final cinematic twist. The cliffhanger the town had not wanted, but that the truth sometimes offers. A sealed envelope was found in a safe deposit box Harold Whitman had kept. It contained a series of Polaroids and a single torn page from a ledger of a local dance instructor, one whose notes bore the kind of shorthand older coaches used. On the torn page, written in a hurried scrawl and folded into a corner, was a phone number and a single name, R. Kincaid. When Boone called the number, the one that had sat ghost-like in paperwork for 30 years, it rang once, then fell into silence. The line belonged, in the end, to an elderly man in a neighboring county who had been a dance coach at the time. He answered with a voice that was guarded and precise. He remembered the Whitmans. He remembered Lori. He did not at first remember a name that matched the one in the Polaroids. But his silence after the call was long enough to allow an imagination to hum with possibilities. Was the coach an accomplice? An observer? Someone who had known and chose to keep quiet? Or did the name mark another trail entirely? One that would take investigators beyond family and rivalry into the wider network of who holds power, influence, and discretion in small communities? The case, Kentucky 1976 cold case solved, had reached a verdict. People named in the official record would be punished, families would be divided, and some small measure of justice would be acknowledged. But the existence of that envelope, those photographs, and the name, R. Kincaid, suggested truths could still lurk in the margins. It reminded the town and the viewers at home that closure is seldom tidy and that history keeps adding footnotes to itself. For the viewers of the documentary, for the town watching, the family listening, and the teens who still dance beneath the same gymnasium lights, the story ended not with finality, but with a question. Who else knew? And would the next chapter reveal more truth or more shadow? The cliffhanger is a human thing. It is the revelation that even solved cases have rooms no one has yet opened. It is the understanding that justice, however cold and mechanical we sometimes insist to be, is also a slow, moral excavation. The arrests in Asheville and the conviction in Lexington set a legal seal. But the torn ledger page proved that human secrets are almost always social things, shared or withheld by the people who surround us. In communities, wounds become part of the architecture. The bench in front of the high school, the roses in a garden, the soft voice of a father who will never quite laugh the same way. These are the human artifacts the case left behind. People continued to gather at the old fairgrounds to dance on summer nights, and some nights someone would look across the lights and see, for an instant, a different time. They would think of Annabel's smile and of the way the town had been forced to reckon with itself. The final scene of this chapter is not a courtroom tableau, but a subtle, private one. Annabel's mother, standing by the bench they had planted, fingers tracing the carved letters. She is quiet. A small boy from down the street runs past, shoes scuffing against the pavement. The mother watches his feet, then reaches into her purse and pulls out an old photograph. Annabel and her ribbon, laughing. And she sets it on the bench like an offering. We keep her memory, she says, to nobody in particular. We keep her name. That is both the ending and the promise. The legal machinery had done its work, imperfect as it is. The town had been titled and tried in public. But memory, the real keeper of anyone's life, had taken up where the courts left off. It would guard and sometimes wound and sometimes heal, and perched at the very edge of that healing was a possibility that the name in the torn ledger would lead to another truth, another reckoning, another place where a long-buried hour might finally be illuminated. If there is a single thing this story asks of viewers, it is this: watch closely, listen to the small things, and do not permit the comfort of a neat ending to cover over the work of asking harder questions. Annabel Smith was a girl who loved to dance. She was, in the end, more than a headline. The town learned a bitter lesson about the cost of silence, and so must we. The camera pulls up from the bench where the photograph sits. The high school lights dim, and a new credit roll begins. But the final image lingers, the torn ledger page with our Kincaid's name, folded and waiting. The question it raises, who else knew and what else was hidden, is the one that cannot be answered here. For that, you will have to stay tuned. They had thought the ledger page with our Kincaid's name was the last thin thread anyone would need to tug. That thread, pulled, would lead to a room with answers and the kind of ugly geometry of responsibility everyone feared. What none of them had expected was that the thread would unravel a seam so long stitched it threatened to tear the town in two. Detective Harry Boone felt the tug first as a careful, practical thing, a call to the neighboring county to ask whether a man named R. Kincaid had coached around Lexington in the mid-70s. The voice on the other end was patient and old. The man remembered names the way some people remember hymns. He remembered Kincaid, he said. He remembered the dance team. He remembered loyalties that ran like water under frozen ground. People liked him, Boone wrote in his margin. Respected him. Hard to pin. Respectability was always a problem in cases like this. It is easier, sometimes, to accuse strangers than to imagine that the people your community trusted might be capable of things that shame them. Kincaid, a man who had taught steps and etiquette, who had been photographed at banquets and whose name was printed in programs as a guarantee of seriousness, was, by every hometown measure, a pillar that made the ledger page heavy. When Boone and the cold case squad drove out to Kincaid's address, they found a house that could have been cut from the same cloth as the Whitmans' tidy lawn, a porch with a swing, a sign in the window advertising lessons. Kincaid answered the door with a cautious smile, hair thinner, but posture upright. The officers showed their warrant with the rawness of procedure and asked for a place to sit. Kincaid offered coffee. In the attic under a tarp, the team found a battered box, and under it, the tape-wrapped remnants of a life preserved in a way that felt calculated. There were programs from dances across 3 counties, letters to parents, schedules, and then folded carefully in a manila envelope there were photographs, Polaroids, yellowed at the edges, faces frozen in mid-laughter, ribbons pinned crooked, teenagers whose lives were now names in a file. They were not labeled. Someone had tucked them into the envelope, turned, and meant to file them away forever. The cache also contained an exercise ledger, Kincaid's handwriting in a precise small script, and beside the dry notes were marginalia that read like a teacher's shorthand. Favorite rivalry. Calm tonight. On the back of one Polaroid, someone had scrawled a date. July 12, 1976. The photograph showed 2 girls at a fair, Annabel among them, hair in the light, ribbon visible. Beside it, tucked like a bookmark in a ledger, was a torn page with the Whitman's ticket stub. Even then, the evidence was not the neat smoking gun a television script would demand. It was pattern and nuance, a paper trail, and a hand that wrote notes about children the way a collector might inventory stamps. But pattern is a kind of truth. Taken all together with the Whitman's concealment and the decades of silence, it showed a man who had watched and recorded, who had an interest in favoriting certain children and perhaps, in the prosecution's view, protecting them. Kincaid was arrested with a face that did not go dramatic. He was someone who had learned to present stillness as an armor. The officers noted later that he spoke politely, that he invoked memories of students fondly. "I loved those kids," he said to a reporter waiting at the courthouse steps. "I always tried to push them to be their best. That is who I was." He did not speak of Annabel in that sentence. He did not, at first, seem like a person with secrets. What the investigators had not expected, and what would become the story's moral tremor, was how many other people would come forward once Kincaid's house was opened. A ledger is a social object. It invites annotation. Once the envelope was public, Other envelopes appeared. Former students, now older and living in other states, mailed in dusty programs and notes. Some wrote letters asking to be anonymous. Others wrote with names and tellings that were vivid and partial and necessary. Patterns emerged that did not require the violent specificity of a confession to be devastating. A dozen women now in their 50s and 60s described the same dynamics. A teacher who favored particular girls, who isolated them for extra lessons, who made a point of being present at their family gatherings. He always had a charm, one wrote. It made us feel special. Another wrote he saw the shy ones and he pulled them forward. And we didn't know why later. The words grooming and manipulation appeared in reports the way a slow leak appears in plaster. Boone realized the case had bifurcated. There was, on one branch, the immediate question the law had to answer. What role, if any, did Kincaid have in the night Annabel died? On the other branch was a broader social question. How had a community allowed patterns of favoritism to become mechanisms of silence? Who had seen and chosen not to act, or to act in ways that covered rather than confronted? The prosecution renewed its focus on the Whitmans in that light. The family had not simply hidden a single crime. They had participated in a climate of protection that reached into institutions. The dance studio, the church, paid lessons, and the local bank. Money and proximity have a way of lubricating silence. People forget that small favors can calcify into compacts. Kincaid's demeanor in the early stages of the trial was calm. He answered questions with a practiced measure. Defense attorneys argued that his notes were the harmless obsessions of a teacher who recorded progress, the kind of conscientiousness educators show in logbooks. He was meticulous, they said. He wasn't sinister. Prosecutors, with a different cadence, invited the jury to understand what meticulousness looks like when it's a method of observing and owning vulnerable lives. Then came the unexpected turn that would push the town into new disquiet. One evening, Boone received a delivery at the station. A small cardboard box, no return address. Inside was a cassette tape and a note written in block letters. Listen, start at the start. It was an old cassette, the kind of thing people used in the 70s to record lectures and dances. Someone, an anonymous someone, had dropped it like a stone into the cold case pond. Tapes are time capsules. This one, when the playback word alive in a quiet interview room, began with a man's voice. It was not the carefully measured timbre of the coach's public statements. It was lower, rougher, and steadier. A man recounting a story in the voice of someone who had rehearsed speaking into an empathy-starved mirror. It was a night of the fair, the voice said, as if instructing itself. There was shouting. She wouldn't stop laughing. It got ugly. We pushed. We fought. The girl fell. They panicked. That was a ledger entry again. But on tape it had an intimacy that writing doesn't. And then, after a pause, the voice continued and in the final few minutes, named the Whitmans and the coach with an obvious contempt. They wanted quiet, the voice said. You'd be surprised what people will do to protect a name. The tape's voice did not exactly match any public figure's register, but it did bear a cadence Boone recognized from past interviews. Not Kincaid's, not Harold Whitman's, but another voice he had heard at town meetings. A county official who had been district attorney in the late 80s and who had, in old memos Boone pulled from the files, advised caution in reopening cases. The thought filled Boone with a cold smallness. If the person who made the tape was telling the truth, and how could they not be on their own recording? Then the problem was bigger than the Whitmans and bigger than an unpopular coach. Before Boone could act, the tape's existence leaked. Word in Lexington moves like a chain letter. It is delicate and then suddenly everywhere. The county was convulsed not by the idea of an arrest, but by the sense that people of power had conspired to protect themselves for decades. The paper that had printed Kincaid's arrest led the story with the tape. Town meetings filled. Churches saw congregations that were less sure-footed than they had been. Mothers who had once lined up their daughters for lessons began to ask different questions. Kincaid's trial became a proxy for the town's own reckoning. Witnesses who might have been silent if Kincaid's envelope had remained private found their voices. A former deputy confessed to suppressing a line in an earlier investigation because a superior had told him it would cause undue harm to reputations. A teacher who had taught with Kincaid said she had once been given cash to cover an expense and now realized the envelope seemed less like a gift than like a bribe. In the meantime, evidence turned up that complicated the neat shape of guilt. Forensics re-examined the alley where Annabel had been found. The lab could not manufacture miracles from the dust of a small town's past. Evidence had been mishandled in the 70s, logs lost or misfiled. But they found a small, overlooked item, a torn ribbon, brittle with time, once pinned to a dress. The lab matched the fabrics, weaved to a dress brand sold only in a particular shop that year. And the shopkeeper, still living and buoyant in the stories of Lexington's past, remembered selling 2 dresses to a woman named June Whitman. The ribbon was a small, specific needle. Small needles stitch large things. The prosecution used this to argue that the Whitmans' concealment and Kincaid's pattern together created a culture where responsibility was negotiated away. The defense mounted its own threads. Kincaid had been a beloved instructor. The Whitmans had acted out of fear. The law had changed. It was a dizzying debate, legal and moral. Then came what would feel, later, like the story's heart, the searching of Kincaid's barn. The barn had been a detail in a database record. Ownership of property listed at the edge of town, a parcel of land where he had once taught outdoors classes in the summer. Boone had the search warrant ready. He had the ledger and the taped voice and enough witnesses to justify an excavation of a man's past. The sheriff's deputies lit the barn with floodlights and set about their work the way archaeologists root through layers of life. What they found was not what anyone had fully expected. There were no skeletons, no contraband, no overt criminal instruments. What they found was the other kind of cache, a room built under a raised floor, with shelves that held boxes upon boxes of preserved memorabilia. There were yearbooks, trophies, scraps of fabric, and chillingly a shoebox with dozens of ribbons labeled with names, not just Annabel's, but other girls from surrounding counties. Inside, neatly folded, were letters addressed to Kincaid from parents thanking him for finding their shy daughters. In the corner, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single dancing shoe worn and small, its leather imprinted with initials that Boone recognized from a police chart as belonging to a teen who had been reported missing in the late 70s. A girl whose disappearance had never been publicly connected to Annabel's case. It was not a violent tableau. It was a room filled with evidence of attention and accumulation, the habits of a man who collected small trophies and who used that collection to exercise influence. The shoebox and the ribbon suggested an obsessive pattern. Kincaid did not simply teach. He curated. He chose favorites and kept their artifacts close, perhaps as trophies of affection or possession. For many, possession is a word that hints at control without needing to specify the damage done. Once that room was cataloged, the level of shock in Lexington moved beyond the personal to the institutional. Families that had once trusted the town's structures now wondered whether the structures had protected predators. More envelopes came in. People wrote of hush money arrangements tacitly made, of lessons paid for in cash, of a calling card left on a seat after a recital. The town's skyline of faith in itself cracked. The legal machinery ground, slow and implacable. Kincaid was indicted on counts of obstruction, grooming, and conspiracy. The district attorney who had been named subtly in the tape's background noise came under scrutiny before questions were dropped for lack of direct evidence. The Whitmans' earlier convictions were revisited in a public moral calculus that pivoted between mercy and moral necessity. What no one had counted on was the human cost of letting this bowl of secrets clatter to the floor. The revelation created a new reverberation. More survivors stepped forward seeking not vengeance, but recognition. They sought apologies, reparations, explanations. Annabel's family, who had once sought little more than truth, found their grief complicated by a social truth they could not undo. They met with women who had danced in Kincaid's studio, and the sharing of memory was not always healing. Memory can reopen wounds. In the midst of a legal storm, a local news team ran a feature on the survivors. One woman, her face a measured map of endurance, sat with a camera crew, and told a story that made the courtroom hush. She spoke of being a shy 15-year-old who had been singled out by Kincaid for special instruction. "He liked the way I listened," she said. "I thought it meant I was good. He told me no one else would care for me like he would." Her words were not dramatic, so much as clear. "I was young," she said, "and I didn't have a voice then. I do now. That I do now was the moment where a town either listened or recoiled." Lexington listened in a fractured way. There was conversation about curriculum changes, about background checks for teachers, about parental responsibility. There was also anger at the past, which the community directed sometimes at symbols. The dance program's banners were taken down, plaques were relocated, and programs from the 70s were placed in sealed display cases with descriptive plaques that no one was quite satisfied with. The trial of R. Kincaid was long and ugly in ways that have nothing to do with gore. It was ugly because it required painful testimony from people who had been children once and were forced to speak about feeling small and controlled. It was ugly because it pressed neighbors into making choices about who they would protect. It was ugly because it asked whether reputation could be considered a legal defense. In the end, the jury delivered a verdict that made some people clap and made others leave the courthouse with a thin, disappointed mouth. Kincaid was convicted on several counts related to abuse of position and to the systematic concealment of complaints. The sentence, while significant, was not the maximal one the prosecution had sought. The law has limits and definitions that do not always align with the moral horror people feel. But conviction carried consequences. One by one, municipal endorsements were rescinded. Courses were re-examined. Parents asked their children new questions. Yet even as Kincaid was led away, Lexington could not claim it had fully purged itself. The taped voice that had named a former district attorney remained an ominous echo. That man, when interviewed, denied wrongdoing in strict and carefully scripted language. He acknowledged poor judgment in handling inquiries but denied any illegal action. The truth for many townsfolk was not a single dramatic moment of confession, but a long, wearying accrual of small, defensible silences. And silence, as the town had learned, is an action too. Then, and this was the detail that would etch the story into the town's memory, an unexpected artifact was found in a place no one had thought to look. Annabel's bench had been a tender place in the town's post-trial landscape. A plaque, some roses, a photograph left by anonymous hands. One spring afternoon, the bench's custodian, a woman who volunteered on weekends to tidy the school grounds, decided to sand the bench lightly and to refinish it. Under the weathered varnish, the old wooden slats were rough with years of rain. When she pried loose a rusted screw to replace it, what she exposed was not rot. It was a cavity, a hollow cut by someone who had known exactly where to tuck things. Inside the hollow, wrapped in oilskin and as if preserved for a moment of its own revelation, was a small sealed envelope. The handwriting on the outside read, "For when they're ready." The custodian brought it to Detective Boone, who felt the small, adolescent panic that arrives when a case opens again after being declared finished. He slit the envelope with as much ceremony as the moment allowed. Inside was a single Polaroid and a folded note. The Polaroid showed a young woman in a dress, but it wasn't Annabel. It was someone else, a girl whose eyes were familiar to anyone who had paid attention. A girl who had grown up in Lexington and who had been photographed at civic events, who led a PDA, and who had recently chaired a committee to place memorials in the town square. Behind her in the photo, half hidden, was the outline of a person whose face the custodian recognized in the way the mind recognizes a refrain. It was Harold Whitman, younger by decades, smiling in a picture with a woman whose hair was cropped like June's had been in old yearbook photos. The note, in handwriting small enough to be careful, read, "They wanted quiet. We wanted different. M." The M was the letter of a name, Marcy Dale. Boone remembered her once more, the woman who had come to him after the trial. The woman who had said, "I didn't tell you everything." She had worked at the concession stand that night. She had been young and frightened, and she had kept something inside her mouth for 30 years. Boone replayed the scene in his head. Marcy had said there had been someone else. She had hinted at a man who favored some students. She had said she had once heard a name in a conversation, maybe Kincaid's, maybe someone else's. The envelope in the bench, hidden beneath the place where people left flowers for Annabel, established that she had kept a deliberate set of evidence and had chosen, for reasons she had yet to speak, to lay it where memory would find it. When Boone and the custodian called Marcy, she did not answer at first. She had moved out of town years ago. Finally, late on a Thursday, she agreed to meet in a church basement with a coffee that tasted of old steel. She looked smaller than Boone had remembered. Her hands were good. They kept arranging and rearranging a napkin. "I kept the things," she said simply. "I thought the right time would come. I thought Annabel's parents would want to know the whole thing someday." Her voice was level. "I didn't want to ruin anyone with rumor while they were alive, but I kept it because I wanted someone to have the truth if they wanted it." She opened her palm and showed a list of names: kids who had been given rides, kids who had been isolated, kids who had been favored. On the list was a name Boone had not expected: Mayor Daniel Keene. Mayor Keene had been a member of so many committees Boone could name him in his sleep. Little League sponsor, PTA board advisor, the voice on the microphone at reunions. He was a safe face. His son had been in Kincaid's classes. The list, held now on a church basement table, suggested he had been present at certain meetings, had been consulted, had been warned perhaps. The implication was not definitive. It was, however, enough to produce a new set of subpoenas. The town, when the list leaked, convulsed in a different way. People who had always trusted Mayor Keene now saw him in the ledger of their reproach. Keene stood on live television and said he regretted that he had not forced the county's hand sooner. He claimed he had been misled by officials who had assured him the Whitmans were cooperating, and that Kincaid was a teacher of uncommon dedication. His words were careful. The town's trust, once cracked, does not reseal easily. Then the final twist came, not in court, but in a simple human image that everyone understood. Marcy, who had carried the cavity's contents for decades, revealed that the small Polaroid she had left under the bench was taken not by an outsider, but by a young Harold Whitman himself. He had photographed a meeting at the church where, according to Marcy, 3 adults had convened late at night to discuss how to manage a situation. Manage was the word she kept using in her interviews. It felt like a clinical euphemism for what she remembered as a panic covenant. Boone called the surviving attendees. One of them, a retired bank manager, refused to speak. Another, frail and contrite, admitted he had signed a document, a confidentiality agreement that he now wished he had not. The picture remained the most direct evidence. It showed Harold and 2 men Boone recognized from the town's elder registry. They were laughing in a way that seemed to be forgetting something terrible. When those images and admissions hit the public square, the community's response escalated into a force that felt less like justice and more like a mechanical compulsion. A special prosecutor convened. Investigators reopened records. Former officials who had once been shields found themselves called to testify. The Whitmans, already convicted, watched this new unfolding with the baffled air of people who had thought their secret would remain small. At last, and this is where the story's final, chilling note settles like a cold stone, there was a legal motion from a civil attorney representing a group of survivors. They filed for the exhumation of the site where Annabel had been buried. The Whitmans resisted. To exhume, they said, would be to rip open a wound that had already been stitched. The prosecutor argued that exhumation was necessary to rule out questions about whether Annabel had been moved, about whether there were physical traces that had been missed, about whether further forensic clarity might reveal more names. The town waited, watching the courthouse steps and the daytime news. The exhumation was scheduled on a dull November morning when the wind tasted like flakes of metal. Cameras were not allowed too close. The crowd kept a respectful distance. Boone felt himself oddly young and absurdly old as he watched the tarp being pulled aside and the grave being approached. When the coffin was opened, the first thing found was not a body misplaced, nor some horrible evidence of further crime. It was instead the small evidence of something else. A metal locket tarnished with age, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into the lining of the coffin. The locket contained a faded photograph of Annabel as a child, her teeth just forming, the small round face that was the one everyone had known. But behind that photograph, folded and preserved with a meticulous hand, was a letter. It had been written in ink that time had browned. It was a letter Marion Whitman, Annabel's mother, confessed to having placed into Annabel's burial at the time. The content of the letter began as a mother's farewell, a line or two of ordinary grief. But in the final paragraph, Marion wrote something that everyone would read aloud in the weeks to come, words that would turn the town's moral calculus into a blaze. She wrote by her own hand, "Forgive us. We thought we were protecting our child. We thought if she could not live with our shame, we would create a story that would be kinder. We did not know this would become a chain. We did not know that the chain would bind others. If there's one thing I can do now, it is this. The truth is worse than the lie. Tell them the names we would not. Tell them who told us to be quiet." The letter did not, in that moment, name additional people, but it released a weight. It was, in itself, an admission that the Whitmans had been more than frightened. They had been entangled in a network of advice and pressure that had been codified in municipal secrecy. The exhumation's discovery made the town understand that the legal convictions were not an end. The letter's last line, "Tell them who told us to be quiet," was an instruction that opened a small, ferocious investigation. Within days, more documents appeared. Bank records surfaced indicating wire transfers to accounts linked with a nonprofit that, upon deeper digging, had been a conduit for paying for lessons and for hush money. Those banks led investigators to a name that had sat for decades at the center of Lexington's civic life. The president of the Civic Trust, a man who had sat on advisory boards and who chaired scholarship committees. He denied wrongdoing. He asserted that payments were loans, that nothing was illicit. But in his private desk, Boone found a bracket of receipts, and in the margin of one receipt was a shorthand note. For Daniel, quiet. Daniel, the mayor, the town's fabric already fraying, began to tear in a way that no one anticipated. The mayor resigned. He did not admit criminal culpability in public. His statements were legal and polished. But in his resignation speech, he spoke of a chain of failures, of an institutional blindness that allowed families like the Whitmans and teachers, like Kincaid, to feel protected. He did not attempt a moral defense. He simply stepped away. And still the last, most chilling moment had not come. It came on a rainy Sunday, when the town was low and strangely quiet. Boone had been sifting through records late into the night, trying to trace tiny anomalies. He kept returning to the same ledger that had started everything. Kincaid's careful handwriting, the Polaroids, the ribbons. On a whim, he lined the photographs across his table and, as if by accident, noticed the background of one, a window pattern that matched a community center kitchen in downtown Lexington. He called the number and arranged a meeting. At the community center, an elderly woman opened the door. Her hands were knotted with age, but her shoulders were the square of someone who had carried responsibility. She asked Boone to come in. Her name was Mrs. Helen Kincaid, no relation to R. Kincaid, she insisted, and she had been the center's coordinator in the 70s. She remembered the dances. She remembered a particular night when a string of teenagers had stayed late to help with cleanup. And in my cupboard, she said, I kept things that were left behind. Tokens, trophies. I didn't throw them out because I thought they might be of use if a family needed them. She led Boone to a storeroom in the back, and in a space where one would least expect it, she produced a shoebox she had kept on a shelf for 30 years. Inside, folded in careful paper, was a single thing that none of the investigators expected: a diary. It belonged to Annabel. Annabel's handwriting was spare and bright. Her pages described dance steps and a crush on the boy from the rival school. They described the smells of summer and the petty competitions of teenagers. And then, in an entry dated 2 weeks before the fair, there was a paragraph that read like a small private shout into the dark. Coach said I could do extra practice. He said I needed to let him see the part one keep in the dark. I don't know what he meant, but my stomach tightened. I told Mom, and she said I was being silly. She laughed and told me to call him Mr. K. He said I would be fine. He asked me to meet after the show. The diary was a voice that had been silenced and hidden in plain sight. It was a young person's fear recorded with that raw, adolescent clarity that makes adult readers' legs go cold. It did not say what happened that night, but it provided context the whole town had been slow to accept. Annabel had felt worried about a teacher. She had told her mother, and her mother had not acted with the protective outrage a parent usually promises. When the diary was read aloud in court weeks later, the room listened the way it listens for a confession. The diary did not produce a confession. It produced accountability for parents, for teachers, for elected officials. It threaded together the idea that Annabel had been seen and that the people who saw had not protected her with the urgency she needed. The chilling finale to the community's long, ragged story did not come as a dramatic last-minute confession or a self-destructive act by a disgraced villain. It came as a public ledger of small, human failures made plain. At a town hall convening to mark the final report, prosecutorial recommendations, lists of implicated officials, a plan for systemic changes, Detective Boone read, in a voice that trembled only a little, a list of names. Not a litany of villains, but a roll call of people who had once been seen looking away. Teachers who had ignored a student's fear, parents who had accepted explanations, officials who had valued reputation over curiosity. The list was long and the room filled with a silence that was not calm. And then a woman in the back stood, a woman Boone recognized as the custodian who had found the envelope in Annabel's bench. And she spoke. Her voice was steady. She said, "We wanted to trust. That is what makes this town beautiful. But it is also what made us cruel. We believed small comforts instead of truth." She walked forward and placed on the table a small box. Inside the box were dozens of ribbons and Polaroids, the artifacts of girls who had been loved and who had been used. The sight of them, cheery things repurposed into evidence, made people step back. The town had to reckon with their own images of themselves. The mayor watched from the back, his face pale. The Whitmans were present, eyes dry, hands folded. Our Kincaid was in custody, his appeals pending. The choir began to sing, and then stopped because a woman's sob broke through. And then, as if to drive the point into bone, a reporter asked a question that made everyone in the room pause. Who else knew? Boone did not answer at first. He looked at the faces gathered and thought of a long chain of small decisions that had allowed one girl's fear to become a town shame. He thought of a note Marion had left in the coffin, of a tape with a voice that named a man, of the shoebox under the bench. He felt the weight of a ledger in his palm. "We know more now than we did," he said finally. "But we also know this. Secrecy is made by people, neighbors, friends, officials, who choose convenience over courage. Names will come. Truth will always come in pieces. It will not be tidy. It will be costly." The cost, Lexington now understood, was not solved simply by the clanging of a gavel. It was paid by families who had to explain decades of silence, by girls who had to retell their stories to officials and to the public, by a town that had to teach its children to ask harder questions than their ancestors had asked. The verdicts were part of that cost. The bench, the letters, the diary. They were part of the reckoning. And yet, as people left the town hall that night, under a sky the color of spent metal, they felt something else. An almost unbearable lightness as well as heaviness, as if a household of ghosts had finally found room to breathe. They had forced a history into daylight, and daylight is a strange thing. It reveals roses and rot with equal candor. A week later, in a small private ceremony, Annabel's family gathered new roses around the bench. There were speeches and music, and children danced in the square. The scar left behind by a town's collective failure would not vanish. But there was an acknowledgement now that memory required action. And the last image that would haunt Lexington for years was not a courtroom or a jail cell, but a small Polaroid held in a woman's shaking hand. Annabel at 17, ribbon in her hair, the sunlight at the county fair catching the edges of her smile. Under it, scrawled perhaps by Marion in a fit of contrition and love, was a single line. She was ours. We failed her. We will not let her be quiet any longer. That line, both apology and oath, echoed in the town's conversations for seasons after. People changed the way they vetted teachers. They instituted background checks and reporting protocols. They instituted memorial scholarships in Annabel's name, given to girls who might otherwise be overlooked. But the real change lived in the awkward, ongoing work of asking questions and of refusing the easy shelter of reputation. The chilling aspect of this ending, what made people gasp and then keep talking, was not a final violent reveal. It was the moral revelation that the town's innocence had always been conditional, that the comfort of small reputations had cost a girl her life, and that many hands for decades had chosen the easier lie. If there is horror in this ending, it is quiet and ordinary. The knowledge that evil is often cataloged in polite handwriting, that favors and convenience can conspire to protect wrongdoing, that communities can become complicit by their very kindness. That, in the end, was the thing that left Lexington stunned. The camera pans away, if this story had won, from the bench where Annabel's photograph sits, toward the square where children play under the same string lights, and lingers on the town hall's brick facade. The ledger pages flutter in a breeze someone left open. The town has changed, and it is not. The story closes with the truth made public and with the knowledge that truth, once released, does what it must. It asks for repair, for confession, for the long, difficult work of listening. And in the months that followed, late at night, when the square was empty and the lights dimmed, people would sometimes glance across at the bench and remember the shutters of secrecy and the small things that kept them closed. They would think of Annabel's smile and, with a new and heavy tenderness, would vow, quietly, privately, to keep their eyes open. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe and share, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery solved cold case videos. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.